The man in the second-hand jacket, heavy with the smell of cigarettes, a baseball cap pulled low, almost covering his eyes, stood silently under the cold, fluorescent lights at exactly 1:57 in the morning at South End Smokehouse in Charlotte, a place the whole city knew for its promise of open all day, every day smoked meat, always ready. Anyone who had ever seen Brian Carter on the cover of food magazines or at restaurant management conferences would never recognize this man now. His jaw was covered with 3 days' worth of stubble, his eyes sunken from lack of sleep, his steps slow with slumped shoulders, just like a laborer finishing a late shift. And no one could have guessed he was the owner of 52 famous restaurants across the United States. No one gave him a second glance as he walked in, aside from the tired, joking laughter of the 2 employees behind the counter. At night, South End was truly a quiet, gloomy, and lonely space. Brian liked that feeling, the sensation of being dismissed completely invisible in the very place he had created. Just a few weeks earlier, he had received an email report about some strange issues at this location. Unpredictable revenue. The late-night menu shortened customers complaining the flavors weren't the same, and anonymous messages warning that management is forcing staff to stay silent. Upstairs, the shareholders only cared about the profit line, but Brian still wanted to listen to every tiny anxiety echoing out of the kitchen. When he approached the counter, the air shifted slightly, like a cold breeze sneaking in through an open door. Dylan Perez, with messy brown hair, bloodshot eyes from lack of sleep, and a dark apron stained with grease, looked up at him with a gaze that was both wary and hopeless. "Large pulled pork extra sauce, please." Brian forced his voice to stay calm, pretending to be just another regular looking for a late-night meal. Dylan froze, his eyes blinking rapidly, glancing back as if something was lurking behind him, then shook his head and whispered, "Sorry, pulled pork, can't serve that at this hour." The neon sign behind him still glowed bright red. Pulled pork signature dish. Open all day, every day. The fear was clear in Dylan's eyes, something Brian immediately recognized, instinct honed by years of rising from poverty and working in small kitchens. The years building his empire had taught him one truth: only those who know fear have the drive to survive in the darkness. Brian gently asked again, feigning surprise, but inside he felt a sharp chill rising. Dylan hesitated. Manager locks up the meat after midnight. It's policy. In that instant, anger surged in Brian's chest. What policy? He was the one who had written every page of the operation manual, and there was never a rule banning pulled pork at any hour. But he controlled himself, choosing to observe rather than reveal his authority. Dylan's hand shook as he counted out the change, his sleeve accidentally pulling up to reveal dark bruises around his left wrist. Evidence of a truth nobody wanted to say out loud. In the back, the kitchen door swung open with a bang, startling everyone at the counter. Greg Nash appeared, the night manager, tall, with broad shoulders, hair-cropped short shirt buttoned up to the neck, his smile touching only his lips, and never his eyes. "Everything okay, Dylan?" His voice was gentle, but his eyes were ice-cold as he glanced over Brian, analyzing him like prey. Brian answered, his voice deep and steady. "Just wanted to try the pulled pork, but he said it's out." Greg looked at Dylan, smirking. "We're out tonight, regular customer, hope you understand." He stepped between Dylan and Brian, pretending to be friendly, but clearly drawing a line. Brian nodded, quietly accepted the substitute tray of grilled chicken, his eyes never leaving Greg's, every move the manager personally taking out the trash, checking the fridge, and constantly keeping everything under his watchful eye. Outside, the garbage truck stopped, but instead of an employee, Greg himself carried 2 large bags to the back parking lot, while Dylan quietly wiped down the counter, his eyes red. From his hidden corner, Brian ate while taking in every detail, from the way staff avoided Greg's gaze to the heavy, suffocating atmosphere that clung to every square foot of the restaurant. He remembered the early nights, smoking each batch of meat by hand, shaking hands with greasy cooks, and wondered when power had become something that forced people into such desperate silence. The moment Greg turned away, Brian unconsciously gripped the spoon tighter, his eyes glinting with the cold resolve of a man who held an entire system in the palm of his hand. But tonight, nobody knew who he was. A powerful owner worth hundreds of millions sat at table 12, judged to be nothing more than a tired worker, quietly waiting for the chance to expose the shadows, hiding behind every piece of smoked meat in this city. The very moment Dylan nervously refused to serve the pulled pork. A wave of suspicion washed over Brian's mind. The menu board still glowed brightly behind him, the red letters "Pulled Pork Open." All day, every day signature dish seemed to challenge any excuse. Whenever a stranger visited one of his restaurants, Brian always wanted them to experience the smoky aroma of the traditional meat he had painstakingly perfected through hundreds of batches of charcoal. But now, right here in his own beloved restaurant, that dish had suddenly vanished from the menu because of some strange policy. The aroma of grilled chicken couldn't mask the twisting sense of unease tightening in his chest. Dylan lowered his head to count, change his hands, trembling, his eyes constantly darting toward the kitchen door, as if afraid someone might suddenly appear. The bruises on his left wrist, a dark ring across the bone, told Brian more than any explanation ever could. In this world, no one falls that hard without the shadow of hidden power looming behind them. Brian's brow furrowed, his heart stretched taut like a string before a storm. The young man before him was barely older than 20, his whole face and posture worn out by endless night shifts, his eyebags dark like old charcoal, his shoulders hunched under a grease-stained apron. In that stance, Brian saw himself from 20 years ago, back when he was a young man, struggling to make a living, always afraid that a single mistake would cost him everything. He asked quietly, "Is the storage always locked after midnight here?" Dylan shook his head, voice dropping to barely a whisper. "No, only at this location. At the others, we'll serve anything the customer orders all night long. Here the manager says it's a new rule, and anyone who questions it gets targeted. One time I asked about the missing meat, and he threatened to cut my hours. Then the next day I somehow slipped and fell in the storage. It still hurts now." Brian kept his face cold and composed, hiding the anger rising inside, because to him, every employee was a piece of the brand's soul. This meal had no taste anymore. Every sense was tuned to the string of abnormalities exposed by every gesture and each fearful word. Greg Nash suddenly returned, his broad shoulders blocking the light from the counter, an indifferent smile as he glanced at Brian, then spoke to Dylan. "If there are customers, hurry up. When the chicken runs out, there's still rib." Brian noticed Greg's gaze, an expression that wasn't just watchful, but probing, checking who would dare break the code of silence. Dylan mumbled yes, and quickly hid his bruised wrist. Greg didn't leave the counter, arms folded across his chest, his sly smile trying hard to appear friendly, but only coming off as fake. Brian took his plate of chicken, accepted his change, his hand steady but his eyes memorizing every sign, every bruise, every glance Dylan cast toward the cold storage. The entire dining room was steeped in a heavy sense of waiting, as if everyone there knew a secret, but no one dared to speak up. In another corner, the register beeped rhythmically. Outside, the stained yellow light fell on the deserted parking lot. Everything seemed normal to the average passerby, but to a boss who once spent countless nights in the kitchen watching over every cut of meat, Brian could feel it. Clearly something was wrong. Terribly wrong, growing larger with each passing night at South End, the place that was supposed to be the warmest heart of the restaurant chain he had built. Greg Nash stood at the counter for exactly 7 minutes, but that was enough to freeze the entire atmosphere of the restaurant. He moved through the areas with the leisurely gait of someone who owned all the power, his eyes quietly sweeping over each employee, never letting Dylan out of his sight for even a moment. Brian kept his head down, pretending to eat his chicken, but he could feel how Greg controlled every movement, how even the smallest whisper would instantly catch Greg's attention. Every so often, Greg interrupted Dylan, telling him to check the storage, double-check the orders, or he would fake friendliness with customers to present himself as the ideal manager, but every gesture was tinged with a hidden threat beneath that layer of politeness. Brian noticed every detail: the way Greg wore a heavy key ring at his hip, how he always paused when passing the cold storage door, his eyes darting across the dining room as if to see whether anyone was watching him unlock it. He realized every staff member had fallen into a repetitive routine, following orders, moving quickly, avoiding the manager's gaze, and absolutely never asking about pulled pork or any of the locked dishes. When Greg signaled, Dylan immediately went to the kitchen and came back just a few minutes later with empty hands and a dazed look in his eyes. Brian casually asked, "Has anyone here worked for a long time?" Dylan replied quietly, "Most of the old staff have been pushed out. Anyone who asks too many questions gets moved to extra shifts. Then suddenly they have no schedule at all." At that moment, Greg turned back to Brian, his smile never reaching his eyes, and asked, "Have you lived in this area long? Our place gets pretty quiet late at night. Sometimes we're out of dishes. Hope you understand." His tone was deliberate, clearly wanting to get rid of the stranger before more questions could come. Brian just smiled and said, "I work late, just like to eat at night." Greg nodded, not hiding his scrutiny, then slowly walked back to the small office at the end of the hallway, the door closing behind him with a harsh click. Dylan's breathing eased a little, but the worry still weighed on his narrow shoulders. Brian realized that whenever Greg wasn't around, the staff finally dared to breathe. But every time his shadow appeared in the kitchen doorway, everyone instantly fell silent, working with precision, never daring to take their eyes off their tasks even for a second. Brian's emotions swirled between anger and pity. He had once dreamed of his restaurant chain being a second home for hard-working young people. But now all he saw were young people bowing their heads in fear and resignation, struggling to survive each night by pretending nothing was wrong. When Greg came out again carrying 2 large trash bags and personally pushing open the back door toward the parking lot, something every other manager would have delegated to staff, Brian knew for certain that in this restaurant the strongest person was also the one who inspired the most fear, while those most deserving of respect were forced to live in silence. Dylan stood in front of the cold storage door, the chill seeping out and making his hands shrink back over the fresh bruises. The heavy key ring at Greg's hip jingled sharply every time he walked closer. A small sound, but for the night shift staff, it was like a warning of the storm about to sweep through the kitchen. Brian quietly took note of everything. Greg always checked the storage at odd, empty times, never announced it, never let anyone else go in with him. He also noticed the inventory logs and ingredient numbers taped outside the logbook all lacked a second signature, meaning for many months only the manager had access with no oversight. A little while later, once Greg had disappeared into his small office, Dylan finally dared to take a deep breath and sneak a drink of water. Brian sat in the corner, pretending to fiddle with an old phone, but his eyes never left Dylan's movements. He saw in the young man a twisting loneliness. Every time he stepped into the kitchen, he tensed up working, while watching every path, every glance. As Dylan wiped down the counter, glancing at the cold storage, Brian quietly asked, "Since when did Greg start locking the storage during shifts?" Dylan hesitated, his eyes dropping. "About 7 or 8 months ago. At first it was just a few times, then it became routine. Anyone who asked would lose hours, get accused of leaking business secrets." He continued, his voice even lower. "At the start, the old manager got transferred after an argument over deliveries. After that, Greg took over, and slowly none of us were allowed to ask about the meat or the numbers. Anyone who spoke up would suddenly lose their shifts the next week, or get sent to a far-off location. Some even got accused of petty theft and were fired on the spot." Brian struggled to hide his emotions, only frowning as he watched Dylan meticulously clean every tray, every scrap of paper, clearly taking his time, just to stay close to the one person tonight, willing to listen. The cold storage door opened again. Greg appeared with a cold expression, shot Dylan a sharp glare that made him flinch and clench the rag so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I'm going to check inventory. By the time I'm back, the kitchen better be spotless." He tossed the order like a stone into cold water, then disappeared behind the line of freezers. Dylan cleaned up quietly, but Brian knew he wouldn't dare move an inch until Greg returned. Just then, a drunken customer staggered in, loudly demanding pulled pork. Dylan panicked, glanced toward the kitchen by reflex, then stammered out a lie. "Sorry, the smoker is broken. We only have wings," the customer yelled. Greg returned like a predator sensing danger. His face darkened, barking, "If you can't serve customers, let me do it." He shoved Dylan aside, personally, threw the customer out, then turned back and hissed just loud enough for the staff to hear. "If I hear anyone mention pulled pork after midnight again, you'd better find another job." Dylan stepped back, lips pressed tight, his eyes darkened with humiliation. Brian swallowed his rising anger, determined not to just stand by. He suggested to Dylan, "If you want to change jobs, I know a few managers at other places." Dylan forced a crooked smile. "Nowhere is worse than here if you get your contract cut. Everyone knows Greg has someone protecting him from above. If you get blacklisted here, you lose work at every restaurant in the system." Only now did Brian truly understand this wasn't just a small case of fraud, but a whole chain of power where silence was bought with fear and the dread of losing one's livelihood. A new female employee, blonde with blue eyes, was called into Greg's office just 10 minutes into her first shift. When she came out, she cried quietly in a dark corner, and the older staff quietly reminded her, "Staying silent is how you survive." Brian felt this toxic culture spreading like a disease through every layer of the staff. The night air at South End was thick with the smell of grilled meat and burning fat, but deep down, it was heavy with fear, helplessness, and the anticipation of an inevitable explosion. When Greg made his rounds again, checking every station in the kitchen, he suddenly grabbed Dylan, squeezing his wrist in front of Brian, and whispered coldly, "Next time a customer complains, you're done. Got it?" The grip was just strong enough to make Dylan wince, but not fight back his eyes, losing another sliver of hope for kindness. Brian realized in that moment that one wrong step, a single glance, one question too far, could crush Dylan's entire future right then and there. He looked around and saw the other employees pretending to be busy, no one daring to look toward the kitchen, no one brave enough to intervene. That very silence only gave Greg more power, turning a restaurant, once proud of being a family for everyone, into a gilded cage for the ones pulling the strings. Brian stood up, leaving his untouched chicken behind, slowly walking toward the door, his eyes never leaving the silent shadows moving around his own restaurant. Before he stepped outside, he caught a glimpse through the back door of Greg stealthily hauling a large tray, possibly pulled pork tightly wrapped in a black bag, as he disappeared toward the parking lot, leaving behind only the jingling of keys and Dylan's terrified reflection in the foggy glass. Brian understood everything was only just beginning. Inside a storm was brewing. He could either stand by and watch young people be crushed one by one, or be ready to tear off the mask of power right in the darkest hour of South End. Brian didn't go home after leaving South End. Instead, he sat quietly in the old Ford he rented by the week the car parked out of sight behind the supermarket lot across the street, the windows fogged up by the cold Charlotte night air. His eyes never stopped scanning the back exit of the restaurant, where the security light flickered across the damp asphalt, waiting for the smallest sign from Greg or Dylan. Brian's phone vibrated gently. A message from an old friend who worked in supply confirmed that the batch of pulled pork delivered last night matched the ordered weight, which meant the missing meat was completely inconsistent with the store's reported revenue. At exactly 2 a.m, Brian watched Greg push a large foam cooler tightly wrapped into the back of an old pickup truck, glancing around before driving out of the lot. Brian started his engine, keeping just enough distance to avoid being noticed, following Greg's truck through yellow-lit intersections, all the way to the warehouse district in the south of the city, where food trucks and small vendors gathered every night for the bustling night market. Greg stopped his truck in a hidden corner between 2 rows of vans, quickly exchanged the cooler with a burly stranger in a leather jacket and silver hair cropped short. In less than 3 minutes, the man checked the goods, slipped Greg a thick envelope, then disappeared into the line of trucks. Brian returned to the restaurant just before dawn, taking notes on his phone, recording every detail, every license plate, every unfamiliar face. He knew that a single careless move could render all his evidence useless and might even put Dylan in danger. The following night, Brian came back to South End in a different outfit this time, applying for a fill-in shift under a fake name. Greg didn't recognize him at all, just skimmed the paperwork, nodded coldly, and ordered, "Only do what you're told and don't ask stupid questions." Brian played the part, flawlessly washing dishes, cleaning storage, helping in the kitchen, trying to get close to Dylan. The two only exchanged glances. Dylan whispered a warning. "Watch out for Greg, don't let him catch you asking about the storage." During his shift, Brian noticed another new hire, a blonde girl visibly anxious, constantly being scolded by Greg, just as fearful as all the other young staff. At midnight, sharp Greg went into the cold storage again. This time, not alone, but carrying an old duffel bag, locking the door for just a few minutes, before coming back out empty-handed, his eyes scanning the kitchen suspiciously. Brian was sure Greg had either hidden something else or was preparing for another delivery. Every movement in the restaurant was tightly controlled. No one was allowed near the cold storage without the manager, and strange deliveries were coded internally, then disappeared from the system. Brian kept playing the part of the night shift worker, and every time Greg made his rounds, Brian found a way to quietly record images, container codes, and logs on scraps of paper left behind by old employees. After a week, Brian had collected a stack of notes filled with secret symbols and video footage of Greg sneaking deliveries to a food truck called Smoke Syndicate, a black truck with a red logo top ranked in the warehouse district's food scene. Brian blended in with the crowd, ordered pulled pork, and with just one bite, He recognized the recipe. The smoky flavor, the seasoning, everything was from Southend. The food truck owner, Max Dawson, approached Brian proudly boasting about his special sauce inside selling for much less than the standard price, and eagerly invited him to join a long-term partnership. Brian listened while quietly recording every conversation, every detail from license plates to receipts, to the way Max mentioned my friend Greg really knows how to work the system. Back in his car, Brian reviewed the evidence Greg controlled the cold storage funneled meat to Max, took cash off the books, silenced staff, even resorted to violence if anyone spoke up. In his mind, a plan formed, one that was no longer just about protecting Dylan or the young staff, but about protecting the honor and the very foundation of the brand he had poured his youth into building. This wasn't about money. It was about restoring the light to those who had been buried under the darkness of power in the sleepless kitchens of Southend. Brian couldn't sleep at all that night. His mind was filled with images flickering through the darkness, the tray of stolen meat, Greg accepting an envelope of cash from Max Dawson, the terrified looks, and the bruises on Dylan's wrist. The next morning, he called an old friend who used to work as a private investigator and asked for help checking into Smoke Syndicate, into Max Dawson, and the shell companies involved in the chain of illegal meat transactions. Within just a few hours, he held a file in his hands. Max had already failed twice, with restaurants had once been suspected of goods fraud, but always escaped charges for lack of evidence. And the receiving company was Southern Foods Direct, a newly formed entity with a registered address that was nothing more than a post office box. Brian sent all the collected documents to the head of legal and the COO at headquarters, ordering a review of all shipments, a full audit of the books, and a specific focus on the Southend inventory for the last 3 months. At the same time, he arranged for secret surveillance cameras to be installed in the cold storage and delivery areas, all under the guise of a routine quality check by management. That night, Brian returned to the restaurant again as a night shift assistant. The later it got, the heavier, the air became every word whispered, and even the rare laughter of young staff fell silent whenever Greg appeared. Dylan pulled Brian aside and spoke in a whisper. "I can't take it much longer. He's not just stealing. Anyone who asks too many questions gets threatened, like Marcus last month, accused of taking money, and then fired. None of us dare report it. Everyone knows Greg has someone protecting him at HQ." Brian looked at Dylan, and for the first time saw the desperate gaze of someone who had lost all faith in any form of justice within the company. Inside, his sympathy turned into a simmering anger mixed with resolve. Around 1 a.m, as Greg started preparing a new shipment, Brian pretended to wash dishes near the cold storage, secretly activating his recording camera. Greg opened the storage, took out large trays of meat, stuffed them into foam bags, went back and forth to his office, constantly checking his phone, as if waiting for a signal from outside. About 20 minutes later, Max Dawson appeared at the side entrance. The two exchanged only a few words, then together carried the meat to the car. The entire exchange, the passing of cash, the paperwork, everything was captured by Brian's hidden camera. At that moment, a tray slipped from his hand and crashed to the floor, making a loud noise that instantly drew Greg's attention. His eyes flashed like knives as he demanded, "What the hell are you doing here?" Brian kept his cool, pretending to be flustered. "My hands were wet. Sorry? I'll clean it up." Greg didn't reply, just stood there staring until Brian bent down to pick up the broken pieces, then finally turned away his face, still suspicious. As the door closed, Brian clenched his fist, knowing he had just taken one step closer now, with photos, with audio, with witnesses. All that remained was one final move to expose the entire operation. In the shadowy corner, Dylan stood still, eyes tightly shut, as if praying for someone to finally break the vicious circle of fear, lies, and power in a kitchen that once was the pride of so many generations of South End staff. Brian left the restaurant close to 3 a.m, exhausted, but his eyes still sharp from the unrelenting rush of adrenaline. He sat quietly in his car, calling and texting the legal investigation team and risk management. We have video the parties exchanging goods and cache full license plates and faces, ready to launch a sting operation within the next 2 days. That night, he didn't go home, but slept in the car, clutching his phone and constantly checking the hidden cameras he had set up. In the morning, Brian received a report. Every financial record at South End showed suspicious ingredient losses, and staff on all shifts confirmed that ever since Greg became manager, no one was allowed to inspect the storage alone. Every inventory receipt bore only Greg's signature, or that of a brand new hire who then quickly disappeared from the system. Dylan and Marcus, 2 former shift leads, had once tried to report this to HR, but right after one was disciplined and sent far away, while the other was falsely accused of embezzlement and lost his shifts entirely. Brian decided to meet Dylan privately during a break, and this time he didn't hide who he was. He took off his glasses and hat, looked Dylan in the eye, and said simply, "I'm Brian Carter. I built this place from nothing, and I will put an end to this. But I need the truth. I need you." Dylan froze for a few seconds. Then his shoulders started to tremble, not from fear but from a hope he hadn't expected. He confessed that every staff member Greg had hurt was threatened, manipulated, or forced to sign false documents. Greg had even bragged that he could ruin anyone's life who dared to report him, boasting about having someone protecting him at headquarters. Marcus was assaulted in the parking lot after once asking about the inventory, and he still hadn't been able to find work elsewhere. Dylan recalled a young woman, Emily, who was accused of losing goods, even though she was just a shift worker, and then disappeared from the company. Hearing all this, Brian's heart burned with both anger and sympathy. He reassured Dylan, "This time I'm behind you. Every piece of evidence, every person, every lawyer is ready. All you have to do is tell everything in front of the executive board. Everyone who's been wronged will have their names cleared. Everyone who hurt others will be held accountable." Dylan nodded, his voice breaking. "I'm not doing this for myself, but for all of them. Marcus, Emily, and every young worker who comes after. If you can save this place, please bring it back to the South End it used to be." Brian looked at Dylan and felt all his fatigue vanish, replaced by a single shining resolve. No one, no matter how powerful, could bury justice under fear forever. That night he returned to the office and summoned the entire executive team. In a brightly lit room that stayed busy well past midnight, he played every video, every recording, every line of evidence, everything that had been buried for nearly a year, laying it all out on the table, ready for the reckoning, and the biggest unmasking in the history of the South End smokehouse chain. Brian had just 1 night left before the trap to expose Greg, and Max Dawson would be set in motion. He returned to South End headquarters, spending the final hours meticulously reviewing every part of the plan. Cameras covered every inch of the cold storage, the back exit, and the parking lot. Videos of cash exchanges, records of discrepancies, and all inventory logs were encrypted and sent simultaneously to the company's legal team, his private attorney, and the city police. The security team was covertly deployed, ready to act on Brian's signal at any moment that night. He was no longer the silent man hidden in the shadows. He had become the commander of the most important battle of his career. A battle not just for reputation or profit, but to save a culture that once prided itself on the idea that every employee was family. As dusk fell, Brian put on his kitchen assistant uniform, tucked the phone with its recording mode into his shirt pocket, and walked into South End under the wary gazes of those accustomed to night shifts, filled only with cold heaviness and forced greetings. Greg appeared unusually calm, glancing over the new employees, unaware of the determined energy radiating from Brian. Dylan was there too, his face tense but his eyes shining with hope. Tonight he was no longer just a lone employee, but an essential link in the plan to bring down the dictatorship that had gripped this place for almost a year. Close to midnight, as the restaurant emptied out, Greg sent several employees home early under the pretext of not enough work, leaving only Brian Dillon and a new hire named Carla, a brown-haired girl who always kept to the far end of the kitchen. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet. The heartbeat of all three synchronized with the ticking of the old clock above the storage door. Greg sat in his small office, with the door slightly open, peering out every time there was an unusual noise from the kitchen. At 12:45, Greg put on his keys and told Dylan to prepare the trash for end-of-shift cleaning. Brian followed closely, pretending to check the dish racks, secretly snapping photos of Greg through the crack of the open door. Greg opened the cold storage, pulled out 3 large trays of tightly wrapped meat, carried them to the prep kitchen, checked his phone, and sent a message. Dylan moved around the trash bins. Carla slipped into the restroom. From the angle of the hidden camera, Brian recorded every detail, Greg counting each tray, packing them into insulated bags, placing them by the back door. Around 1 a.m, Max Dawson appeared at the side entrance, looking confident, wearing a brown leather jacket, his eyes darting constantly. Greg quickly opened the door, exchanged a few words, checked the goods, and together they hauled the bags out to the back parking lot. The whole process took just 7 minutes, seemingly flawless. But this time, as Greg turned back towards the kitchen, Brian deliberately made a loud noise, dropping a metal tray so Greg would have to come check. At that very moment, the security team, in coordination with undercover police officers, closed in on Max Dawson and Greg in the parking lot. Before Greg could react, his phone rang. The call was from the CEO of South End, who confirmed, "We have collected all the evidence. You are officially suspended and will be prosecuted. Security and police will handle the next steps." Max Dawson struggled and shouted, but within minutes he was handcuffed and put in a police car. All the evidence meet, cash-forged documents seized as proof. In the kitchen, Dylan froze when he heard the sirens outside, tears streaming down his face. Carla clung to her lunchbox, eyes wide with shock. Brian took off his glasses, removed his hat, and lifted his head to reveal his true identity to the staff. "For the first time, I am Brian Carter, the founder of South End Smokehouse. I'm sorry for how long you all had to endure this, sorry for what Greg did to you. But from today on, everything changes." He stepped out of the kitchen, walked over to Dylan, and gently placed a hand on his shoulder like a father to his son. "You did great. Because of you, no one will have to live in fear in this kitchen again." Dylan burst into tears, and for the first time in nearly a year, he felt he was no longer alone and no longer threatened. The security team proceeded to search Greg's office, uncovering a series of forged documents, off-the-books ledgers, and conflicting invoices directly tied to Max Dawson and the shell company Southern Foods Direct. Police made an official record, seized all data storage devices, pulled security camera footage, and verified every delivery and invoice from the past 8 months. Staff who had been wrongly accused, fired, or forced to sign false statements were contacted to match their stories with the evidence and prepare to have their jobs restored. The night scene at South End was no longer suffocating with fear. One by one, the young staff lifted their heads, looking towards the light, waiting for a new future, where kindness was no longer threatened, where every shift was no longer just a string of tense, anxious hours. Brian sat at a table, his eyes firm but warm, feeling deeply the meaning of all the years he had poured into this place, not just to make himself wealthy, but to protect every value he had promised to every young person who ever placed their trust in a place called the South End home. When the last police cars pulled away, Brian remained with Dylan and Carla, listening to their stories of fear of dreams, once crushed, of the faith that had been reborn after the longest night in South End's history. He made a promise. From tomorrow, South End will change. No one will have the right to access the storage alone. Every shift will have public camera surveillance. Every complaint will have a direct hotline to me and the leadership. No one, absolutely no one, will ever have to fear working through the night again. As the night ended, what Brian felt was not just the triumph of a great battle, but profound gratitude for the courage of people like Dylan, for a team that dared to confront darkness and save themselves, and the spirit of a brand he had spent a lifetime building. South End shone bright again, this time with the light of real kindness and justice finally restored in the heart of the night. On the first morning after Greg Nash and Max Dawson were exposed, South End seemed like a completely different place. The suffocating atmosphere was gone. No more averted eyes. No more silent fear haunting every corner of the kitchen as it had for nearly a year. Brian Carter appeared before the staff, no longer as a silent stranger but as the founder, the true owner, with eyes shining with determination and gratitude. He spent hours meeting each person, listening to their stories, their pain, their frustration, and the fragile hopes that had been crushed by the power Greg and his accomplices abused. Dylan recounted everything to Brian and the investigation team. The threats, how Marcus was falsely accused of embezzlement, the endless nights where the team could only exchange worried glances, how Greg always exploited new hires, or those without family backing for his own gain. He admitted that if Brian hadn't stepped in personally, everyone would have remained silent, or left letting the strong continue to manipulate everything. That morning's meeting felt truly different. Those who once only bowed their heads and followed orders now took the initiative to ask questions, to respond directly to policies, and to propose changes. Brian made all the evidence public, explained every detail of the plan in cooperation with the legal team, the police, and security. He emphasized, "If it wasn't for your persistence, each and every one of you, every smallest voice, the truth would never have come to light. You are the soul of South End, not any title out there." His words swept through the room like a fresh wind, prompting applause, sighs of relief, and even silent tears from the young people who had finally been heard. Brian went further, reaching out to former employees who had been wrongfully dismissed, like Marcus Emily, and those transferred to other locations for daring to speak out about irregularities. He and the HR team reviewed every disciplinary action, checked the records of every case Greg had used to silence rebellious staff. Within 3 days, a list of wrongly treated cases was made public, along with a formal apology from the leadership and a commitment to compensate lost income, restore positions, or offer new roles depending on each person's wishes. Marcus, who had been accused of stealing cash and beaten in the parking lot, was welcomed back with open arms. Emily, who, as a shift lead, had been forced to sign a blank confession for a missing shipment, had all her rights restored, and was offered additional psychological support, as what she went through under Greg was more than just the loss of a job. It was a shattering of faith in justice at work. Not stopping at internal resolution, Brian ordered the legal team to proceed with lawsuits against Greg Nash, Max Dawson, and their accomplices for asset fraud, assault, threats, manipulation, and falsifying business records. He personally directed the investigation team to work with police to seize evidence trace financial flows through shell companies like Southern Foods Direct and investigate suspicious transactions with food trucks that had sold stolen meat. Every ledger invoice and email was carefully analyzed to reveal the links between Greg and Max. When news of the arrests became public, local media, popular food blogs, and social networks erupted with debates on ethics in the restaurant industry about leadership responsibility in allowing power to be abused and about the invisible fear that erodes young people's faith in decency. For a week after the crisis, Brian practically lived at South End. Every morning he personally supervised opening shifts. Each afternoon he spoke with groups of staff about their concerns. Every evening he reorganized training on culture, emotional management, and resisting manipulation. He put up a large board at the entrance, listing a special hotline so anyone could contact him or the legal team directly. Any complaint about abuse, fraud, or violence would be absolutely confidential and handled independently without passing through any manager. For the first time in years, South End rang with real laughter, genuine greetings and handshakes between old and new staff, free from the cold shadow of power Greg had left behind. One evening, Dylan waited for Brian at the end of the kitchen, hands trembling, but his eyes filled with emotion. "If it weren't for you, we would never have dreamed South End could return to what it was. Since I was young, I always thought working here was a source of pride, a family, but for almost a year every day I just wanted to run away. Now I want to stay to rebuild everything with you and everyone." Brian hugged Dylan gently, feeling how much the boy who once cowered in the shadows had changed, now able to stand up, speak his truth, and inspire the next generation. The positive energy radiated far beyond South End, drawing attention and empathy from longtime customers. Within a week, revenue rebounded by 30%, and returning customers outnumbered even pre-pandemic levels. On local food forums, many diners shared their new experiences at South End, the changes in atmosphere service, even the way owner Brian Carter was willing to sit and listen to every young person's story. Some joked, "For the first time, eating here feels like coming home, because everyone can speak their truth, even the youngest in the kitchen." An 80-year-old woman, a loyal customer since South End first opened, sent Brian a handwritten letter. "You haven't just kept the best pulled pork in town, you've preserved kindness and respect for every person who gives it flavor." Brian knew the greatest victory wasn't taking Greg to court or recovering stolen funds, but restoring trust among the young people who had been oppressed, reigniting motivation to work with their whole hearts. He decided to launch a leadership training program, inviting people like Dylan, Marcus, and Emily to become mentors for new employees, guiding them with skills, and sharing their stories, helping the next generation avoid the fear and silence they once endured. He also revived the financial support program for staff in hardship and set up a small South End Rising scholarship fund to help the children of the most dedicated workers in the chain. After this crisis, Brian realized true power was not in the title of CEO or owner, but in the ability to listen, in the courage to stand up for the vulnerable, and in the determination never to compromise with darkness, not even once. In the weekend meeting with all staff, he shared, "We can't control every event, but we can choose how to face them and protect each other. From now on, South End will be a safe place where every voice is heard, even the smallest one. That night as the restaurant closed, Dylan sent Brian a message. I just finished my first shift as the new night manager. The team did great. No one cries from fear anymore. Thank you for being there at the right moment. Brian smiled, saved the message in his Reasons to Keep Going folder, then returned to his office opening the new risk control plan for the whole company, knowing that his real mission had only just begun. South End had come back to life stronger, more united, and brighter than any financial success he had ever achieved. Brian left the office after a long day working with the new management team, feeling a profound sense of relief in every step. He no longer needed to wear a disguise, no longer had to play the part of a stranger or avoid people's eyes. South End had truly returned to the spirit he had always dreamed of, from the very beginning, a place where every person is respected, protected, and empowered to speak up. The new policies quickly became part of daily life. Every inventory order was double-checked. Every shift had the right to anonymously report unusual behavior, and the hotline connecting directly to the CEO's office was always active with no message ever ignored. Former employees were invited back. New hires were thoroughly trained in South End's culture of no one stands alone, forming a uniquely close-knit team. A week later, Brian returned to South End not as an investigator, but as a regular guest at his own restaurant. He ordered a plate of pulled pork and sat at the window table watching Dylan run his first night shift as the youngest manager in the restaurant's history. The atmosphere was completely different. No more staff avoiding each other. No more tense silence or fearful glances. Instead, there were cheerful greetings, laughter among the team, and a quiet confidence in the way everyone worked. Dylan checked the storage with a new female employee, explaining each step of the inventory control process, then guided her as she recorded each number. When orders came in, the team worked together smoothly and quickly, each person taking responsibility for their role without the manager needing to watch every move. Brian felt the pride and sense of freedom radiating through every corner of the restaurant. After the rush, Dylan approached Brian's table, set down a glass of cold water, and gave a bright smile. For the first time, his eyes held no trace of darkness. Thank you. It's all because of you that everything changed. I once thought I could never trust a decent workplace again, but now I just want to hold on to this feeling forever. Brian patted Dylan's shoulder, his heart full of emotion. He understood now that the greatest value wasn't in profit or reputation, but in the strength of a team, in the courage to step out of the shadows and rebuild trust together. News of the scandal and the dramatic turnaround at South End spread quickly throughout the culinary community, with many places looking to it as a new model for transparency and protecting workers in the restaurant industry. Brian received hundreds of thank you emails and dozens of invitations to speak about organizational culture. But he always emphasized one thing. The most important thing is never letting power become something to fear, always putting people above every payroll and every financial report. South End became busy again, with streams of customers coming and going, and the staff who once lived in silent fear were now the heart and warmth of every late night in that kitchen. On a weekend night, as the restaurant prepared to close, Brian received a short message from Dylan. I'm not afraid of the dark anymore, because you showed us how to turn it into light. Brian smiled, knowing that the greatest legacy of his life would never just be a successful restaurant chain, but a community where kindness and courage will never be forgotten. From the perspective of an expert in corporate culture and sustainable systems, building Brian Carter's story, is not just a journey of exposing a chain of fraud in the shadows, but a vivid testament to the core values of true leadership. Real strength does not lie in the power to control or in the numbers on a report, but in the ability to see every individual behind the uniform, to be willing to step into the darkest corners of the system, and to take responsibility when mistakes are made. An organization is truly strong only when even the smallest voices are heard and protected. It is Brian's unwavering drive for change from a hidden CEO to someone willing to confront pain and restore justice to each person that has revived South End's culture, transforming it into a firm foundation for hundreds of young employees. If this story has moved you, please like and subscribe to join us on more journeys to restore justice and rebuild trust. Don't forget to leave a comment with the words, "Dare to stand," if you believe that justice is never just for those with the most power.